Good morning, everyone. My name is Landon Borders, and I'm the Executive Director of UK Innovation Connect, a new program with UK Innovate providing dedicated resources to support collaborative research and innovation with corporate partners. I would like to welcome you all to our virtual event this morning to learn more about the National Science Foundation's first new directorate in over 30 years, focusing on technology, innovation, and partnerships, otherwise known as TIP. I'm pleased to see so many great businesses, nonprofits, government, and academic institutions from across Kentucky and surrounding regions are represented here today. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few ground rules. Please keep your microphones muted at all times and note that live transcript has been enabled. Following the TIP program overview, there will be ample time for Q&A. I ask that you send all questions directly to me via chat, and I will do my best to address each of them before the end of our time together. This session is also being recorded and will be made available on the UK Innovate YouTube channel. As a participant, you will receive a link to the recording via email. At this time, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you the Vice President for Research at the University of Kentucky, Dr. Cassis. As Vice President for Research, Dr. Cassis leads the university's research enterprise and oversees research proposal development, grants and contracts administration, research integrity, intellectual property and commercialization, federal relations, research IT, research communications, 13 multidisciplinary research centers and institutes, and 7 service corps facilities. Please welcome Dr. Cassis.
Thank you, Brandon. Good morning, everyone. As you heard from Brandon, in March of this year, the NSF announced a new directorate within the National Science Foundation that focuses on technology, innovation, and partnerships, which we've heard is called TIP. So this new directorate, which is the NSF's first in more than 30 years, builds upon that agency's commitment over 7 decades to serve as a beacon for U.S. innovation, advancing the frontiers of research and education across all fields of science and engineering. For us, TIP is a real critical element of NSF's support for future science and technology leaders who reflect the rich cultural and geographic diversity across the United States, one of the nation's greatest advantages in global competition and leadership. NSF has selected Dr. Irwin Gianchandri to be the inaugural NSF Assistant Director for TIP and to lead the new directorate. The agency itself cites Gianchandani is a visionary leader with a wealth of experience in research, innovation, and partnership programs, having served as the NSF Deputy Assistant Director for Computer and Information Sciences and Engineering and the Deputy Division Director for the CISE Division of Computer and Network Systems. We have something in common, Dr. Gianchandani. We both worked at the University of Virginia previously, but your position as Director of Innovation and Networking in the Office of the Vice President for Research was way more important than my University of Virginia postdoctoral days studying cardiovascular pharmacology. Earlier this month, TIP announced a new funding opportunity known as NSF Regional Innovation Engines, which seeks regional teams that are rooted within industry, academia, government, nonprofits, civil society, and communities of practice to catalyze and foster innovation ecosystems across the U.S., addressing national and societal challenges and promoting and stimulating economic growth and job creation, regional innovation, and nurturing our diverse talent. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Gianchandani for being with us today. We're excited to learn more about TIP under his leadership, and we will work with UK investigators and others to develop compelling applications for the program on behalf of the University of Kentucky. Welcome, sir.
All right. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Cassis, and good morning to you, and good morning to all of my colleagues at the University of Kentucky and and really all across the state of Kentucky. It is a pleasure to be with you today. That was a kind introduction. I agree with just about everything that you said, Lisa, except for the one point about my position at UVA being way more important. All of our positions are important. We're all doing important stuff, and it's really great to be collaborating with colleagues across the spectrum. So thank you all for having me today. Landon and others asked if I could take about a half hour, 35 minutes or so this morning and provide an overview of the Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And so the way I'm going to do that is by first starting out with a little bit of motivation or inspiration. Why a new directorate? You've heard that this is the first time in 32 years that we've stood up a new directorate at the foundation. So we don't do this every day, and it really is a once in a generation opportunity moment for us at NSF, and we think for all of us across the country. And so I'll talk a little bit about that inspiration and thus how that leads to the mission and vision of the directorate. And then I'll step through both the functions of the directorate that we see, as well as the programs, the form, if you will, form following function, some of the key programs, including the regional innovation accelerators, which I think many of you have heard a bit about already over the course of this week through the webinars and roadshows that we've been starting to do. So let me first start with just a little bit of context setting. I know many of you are at the university and very familiar with NSF, but I also know that Landon and company have brought together a very diverse set of stakeholders for this conversation today. And so I'm starting with the NSF mission and a little bit of context about NSF for two reasons. One, because I'd love to be able to talk about NSF to that broader set of you who maybe have less familiarity with our organization. But secondly, because I want to emphasize the relationship between the new TIP Directorate and the NSF mission. I've heard sometimes in the community folks wondering, is this really aligned with the NSF mission? And so I'd like to take just a little bit of time at the outset to describe to you how we see it as tremendously aligned with the NSF mission. So for 72 years now, since our founding in 1950, the National Science Foundation has sought to promote the progress of science, advance the nation's health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the nation's defense. And we do that by supporting research and education and infrastructure to enable that research and education in nearly every field of science and engineering, from biology to engineering to computer science to education to social, behavioral, economic sciences and beyond. Pretty much the only area that we don't touch is medical research, since that tends to be the purview of our colleagues up the road at the National Institutes of Health, though we do collaborate with NIH on, for example, health information technologies and the delivery of healthcare and healthcare services. In a typical year, our budget is on the order of about $8.5 to $9 billion. So for example, the most recently enacted budget for the current fiscal year that we're in, $8.8 billion. And we're proud of a couple of numbers on this chart. The 93% of funding that goes out the door in the form of research grants and cooperative agreements and contracts to you all, to allow you all to be able to do the great work that you do on a day-to-day basis. The 318,000 folks, including some of you and folks all across this country whom we support through that investment, faculty, students at all levels, and so forth. And the $181 million that NSF put in the most recent fiscal year, for instance, to seed partnerships with the private sector, to seed partnerships with nonprofits and philanthropic organizations. And you'll hear me talk more about the value of partnerships. It is, after all, in the name of the directorate as we go through this talk this morning. And one final slide, just in terms of grounding here. So it's worth noting that across different fields of science and engineering, NSF has sometimes an outsized role within the federal government in terms of the support for academic basic research that takes place all across this country. You know, it's often said that institutions of higher education, the reason the US is a leader in so many fields is because of our institutions of higher education and the work that you all do on a day-to-day basis. Well, that work is often supported by NSF in fields like the engineering, in engineering fields. Almost half of the investment in basic research in academic settings coming through NSF when it's federally funded. In computer science, more than 3/4 of all federally funded academic basic research coming through NSF. So we track these numbers because frankly, they keep us up at night a little bit. As the NSF's budget grows, so goes the impact on the broader academic enterprise and the broader research enterprise in our country. So with that as context, you know, I would argue that at the moment we are facing a defining moment all across our country. It's a defining moment for 4 reasons in particular. This slide enumerates 3 of them, and I'll talk about a 4th one on the next one. So we are faced with intense global competition all across the country today, all across the world, I should say today. And that is to say that other countries are investing. Sometimes the rate of growth of their investment is faster than that of the US, but investing heavily in key critical and emerging technology areas like artificial intelligence and biotechnology and so forth. Really investing in R&D broadly, to be quite honest. At the same time, we recognize that this is a bipartisan moment. We are seeing support in both chambers of Congress. We are seeing support on both sides of the aisle. We are seeing support with the administration for the work that NSF funds in terms of basic research all across this country and how that has for years allowed the US to be at the vanguard of competitiveness all around the globe. And then finally, something that the VPR mentioned at the outset, a key focus increasingly over the last few years has been on how do we do a better job of engaging folks from all different backgrounds, all different geographic locations, all different socioeconomic statuses. How do we do a better job of engaging folks who are talented in their own right and who could become interested in STEM fields and could engage in STEM fields at all different levels, not just necessarily as PhD trained researchers, but potentially as technicians, as practitioners, as educators in their own right, as entrepreneurs. And so we have an incumbent responsibility to really try to seek out talent everywhere and give opportunities everywhere for that talent. And the fourth kind of critical element of this defining moment is the changing science and engineering enterprise itself. And I think you all would agree that in every field, and nearly every sector for that matter, the pace of discovery has been dramatically accelerated over the course of just the last decade as a result of access to unprecedented amounts of data, those data coming off of sensors that we've deployed, new sensor technologies, as well as access to emerging technologies like machine learning that allow us to be able to in real time extract meaningful insights from those data and help inform decision making. When we think about today's earlier career folks, in fact, some of the students coming into classrooms today all across the country, even just the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic, I think we're hearing that students' views have been shaped by that pandemic. And there is a sense of how can they learn about science and engineering, engage in science and engineering to be able to have a positive impact on society. And that's as a result of what they saw with science and engineering and the vaccines and other COVID-19 related impacts over the course of the last few years. And then finally, if we think about where talent is today, specifically STEM talent. It used to be that we would train folks, oftentimes PhDs, oftentimes they go into academia. Increasingly, that became academia and industry. Now today, talent is in all different sectors: state, local, tribal governments, civil society, communities of practice. And so we have an opportunity to be able to leverage partnerships to be able to bring together blended teams that allow us to advance science and engineering through those varied perspectives that can be brought to the table working collectively. And so that set of characteristics, the intense global competition, the moment of bipartisan support that we've seen with various pieces of legislation on the Hill, the fact that we need to do a better job of engaging talent everywhere, and then the changing science and engineering enterprise takes us to a sense of, can we find ways to meet this moment with somewhat of an intentional focus? And so on this slide, you see sort of the research space in terms of various research areas and types of research that are supported on a day-to-day basis all across this country. The National Science Foundation's mission space has really been in the top half of this chart, right? On the spectrum of basic research, from pure basic research to use-inspired basic research. On one end of the spectrum, pure basic research, sort of curiosity-driven discovery research. An example is something that we announced a week ago in a day last Thursday, the discovery of the Milky Way's black hole. Right? That's an example of curiosity-driven, discovery-based explorations. Though I think you all would acknowledge when we think about the technology in the telescopes, when we think about the data analytics that had to be done to be able to unearth that black hole, there was a lot of more use-inspired work as well that was supported in that curiosity discovery. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, if we think about the things that have happened as a result of COVID-19, within a matter of weeks of this being declared a pandemic here in the US, NSF announced support for rapid response research grants. We ultimately funded over $200 million in grants all across the country that helped in a number of different ways, including, for example, modeling of the spike protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus that allowed us to get better characterization of how that virus works and helped lead to the vaccines that we eventually saw. So really trying to support research on that full spectrum. And it is a spectrum. It's not an either or, though for the sake of these two slides, I tried to give a couple of very concrete examples. Third dimension that we support out of NSF is translation and innovation. It's really a third axis, if you will. We were, for example, pioneering the Small Business Innovation Research Program in the 1970s that has now been adopted by other agencies in the federal government. The I-Corps program that we pioneered in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so we have investments in that space too to help accelerate the research to practice in a variety of different contexts. What we have traditionally not invested in is pure applied research on the bottom right-hand portion of this chart, which is often the purview of other mission-oriented agencies within the federal government, as well as private industry. And so when you think about that moment that I described earlier, we see an opportunity to put an intentional spotlight on a couple of the dimensions on this chart: use-inspired basic research, as well as the translation of that research to practice in terms of nearer-term solution-oriented work. And so another way of saying this is, if you look across our existing directorates and offices within the foundation, I want to emphasize this is a honeycomb for a reason. It's not that these are siloed. I think some of you may be well aware. We have a number of programs that cross-cut multiple directorates and try to bring that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, convergent perspective to bear. With the TIP directorate, we want to enhance that. And in particular, we view TIP as a cross-cut, as a horizontal that will work very closely with each of our existing directorates across the foundation, and specifically work to try to strengthen and scale the investments that each of the directorates is making to varying degrees around use-inspired and translational work. So if I were to distill everything that I've said over the last few slides into just one slide, it is a bit of a paradigm shift that we're talking about here. On the left-hand side, a lot of NSF's investments today, and I want to be clear that this is broad brushstrokes. So for all that I say on the left-hand side, you could probably find a number of examples of work that we're funding today that's going to be on the right-hand side of this slide. But in general, a lot of NSF's investments historically and through today have been largely investigator-driven, primarily academic research teams, and they have resulted in a steady stream of discoveries that have improved our quality of life all across this country and around the globe. And what we'd like to do with TIP is to expand on that footprint just a little bit and really put a spotlight on the users, the beneficiaries, the consumers of the research, and help them be able to engage in shaping and then working together with researchers in conducting that research, in piloting and prototyping and understanding how research-based solutions are actually impacting things, and then potentially starting over and repeating that process in a very iterative fashion. So this is about trying to bring together multi-sector teams that include academia, but go beyond academia as well, and really putting a spotlight on the important societal, economic, technological problems that can drive our research pursuits into the future. So another way of thinking about this is, a lot of what we've done historically has been funding great ideas, great researchers, great students, resulting in great new scientific discoveries and technologies that we then try to push to the market and to society. And here, we want to bring that market to bear from the get-go to help shape some of those research directions so that the market is then incentivized to additionally accelerate the translation of that work to practice as well. And so that is the context that led us at the National Science Foundation, with the support of our colleagues on Capitol Hill and the administration, who have been thinking about this sort of vision for quite some time as well, to establish the Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP, back on March 16th. We said it then, I'll say it again now for emphasis. This is really a critical first step in our minds to be able to accelerate new technologies, new products, and improve our quality of life and jobs and the economy more generally going forward. That being said, it is a critical first step, and we look to Congress and others to be able to provide the appropriations in the out years that allow us to be able to really scale our investments through TIP and achieve the vision that I've described fully into the future. And indeed, the president's budget request for FY 2023 that I think some of you have seen, this is a request that's gone forward to Congress. Now Congress has to decide what it wants to do in terms of appropriations for FY 2023, the fiscal year that starts on October 1st in the federal government. This budget request calls for a funding level for the National Science Foundation of $10.5 billion almost. That's about a 20% increase over our current level of $8.8 billion. And that paves the way for an investment of close to $900 million in the TIP Directorate, as well as investments through TIP, but also in collaboration through the other directorates in a number of key technology areas, from advanced manufacturing to wireless, to materials, to AI, to biotech, to microelectronics, and to quantum information science and beyond. I've just picked a selected few here for the sake of illustrative purposes. One thing that I want to highlight on this slide, because I get this question from time to time as well, and I just want to make sure that it's clear from the beginning. We're talking about an increase to the NSF budget in this request anyway. It's a request, it's not official yet in this request, of about $1.7 billion. And that $1.7 billion includes about a $500 million increase specifically for TIP. So you'll see in the next few slides, there are some existing programs at NSF that we're repositioning into TIP, and those come with existing resources. And so we're talking about an additional $500 million on top of that. So that's $500 million out of a $1.7 billion augmentation to the NSF budget. So really trying to stress here that we're taking a balanced approach. This is not about abandoning our mission space around curiosity-driven science. We want to grow our investments there. It's about a rising tide lifts all boats and really trying to ensure that we don't rob Peter in order to be able to pay for Paul, if you will. So I hope that that gives you a bit of context in terms of the inspiration, the motivation for the TIP Directorate, a little bit about what the mission and vision for the Directorate would be. And I'm going to take the next few slides now to dive into the functions. How do I translate that mission into key functional aspects for the Directorate? And on this slide, and on the next few that look like this, you'll see at the bottom that honeycomb of directorates, and then you'll see kind of a horizontal enumerated on top of that. And that's intentional, right? This is meant to be a crosscut that's going to work collaboratively with all of our partner sister directorates across the foundation. So for us, partnerships is a basic building block for TIP. For us to be able to deliver on the mission and vision that I just articulated, bringing together those users, those beneficiaries of research, helping to inspire research directions, it's going to require partnering across sectors to be able to really lend itself to surfacing some of those key research challenges and opportunities, and then driving forward progress on those. An example of that, just up the road from Kentucky, back in January, I think many of you will recall, Intel announced a new investment in the state of Ohio to the tune of about $20 billion to be able to support building out 2 new chip making factories in Ohio, specifically in an effort to try to onshore chip making here in the US again. And this builds off of an announcement that Intel made in the state of Arizona back last year. As part of this $20 billion investment, Intel announced a collaboration with NSF. We've worked with Intel for a number of years, and so this is building on that collaboration. This collaboration is to the tune of $100 million. And what it says is that over the course of the next several years, Intel is going to provide $50 million. NSF is going to match that with $50 million in order to be able to support colleges and universities all across the country in both research as well as education activities around semiconductor design and manufacturing. And a particular focus here is on thinking about the new curricular and instructional materials, the new training, the teachers or teacher professional development that we're going to need in order to be able to help prepare folks with the latest, greatest science and technology around semiconductor design and manufacturing for the jobs of the future, again, at all levels, not just PhD talent, though we want to support that as well, but thinking about all different levels of talent, as well as reskilling and upskilling the current workforce too. So that's an example of the kind of partnership, in that case, a direct partnership between NSF and Intel. We want to see our ability to be able to catalyze partnerships among universities and industry and others as well. But the kind of partnership that we want to see as a sort of basis set for being able to then give rise to innovation and technology ecosystems, which sort of constitute the next functional layer on top for the directorate. And here we're talking about trying to see through how do we build out innovation and technology ecosystems in all different parts of the country that spur critical new and emerging technologies, and also address some of the key societal and economic and technological challenges that we face within those regions across the country. So here you'll see different shadings of color. In dark blue or sky blue, I suppose, is the Convergence Accelerator. And so this is an example of a place where there's an existing program within NSF. In the case of the Convergence Accelerator, it's about trying to support use-inspired research in all different disciplines of science and engineering. So over the course of the last 3 years, the Convergence Accelerator has funded a total of almost 10 tracks now, ranging from investments in AI and AI meets the workplace and how do we facilitate human AI symbiosis as we move forward, to innovations in quantum computing platforms, to thinking about the networked blue economy, ocean sciences and deploying sensors and so forth to facilitate ocean innovation, waterway innovation, trust and authenticity of our communication systems. We've seen that a lot in the news lately, thinking about enhancing technology opportunities for persons with disabilities and so forth. So really very focused tracks around use-inspired research that bring together stakeholders from academia, industry, and elsewhere to not only spur the research directions, but also the translation of that research to practice. So that's an example of a program that's moving into TIP because it aligns very prominently with the TIP mission space, but then also thinking about new investments that we could facilitate around emerging tech, around regional innovation, and especially too around experiential and entrepreneurial learning. How do we train the next generation of talent at all those levels that I talked about? Community colleges, K through 12 environments, engaging students early on in STEM. Maybe some of them stick with STEM all the way to a PhD. Maybe others of them benefit from that training and go off and take a job in the private sector or in a state, local, tribal government or elsewhere. But how do we provide them with the practical experiences that marry with the in-classroom instruction so that they can be better prepared for jobs on day one? And then one layer on top of the innovation and technology ecosystems is thinking about technology translation. How do I help facilitate the translation of those new innovations into the marketplace, but also beyond the marketplace? So we have a vibrant lab to market platform, as some of you know, starting out with iCore that provides entrepreneurial education and helps with customer discovery and market fitness for your concept. Progressing to PFI, Partnerships for Innovation, where you can form partnerships with private sector interests to be able to start licensing your work and start piloting it in settings and learning from that. And then SBIR-STTR, which allows for us to de-risk deep technology ventures that can then catalyze and go off on their own. So that's a vibrant lab to market platform. But one of the things that we're also interested in is how do we facilitate other forms of lab to X? So the X there could be innovations that result in open source ecosystems. For example, we've seen in the wireless space that open source offers a competitive advantage to closed box approaches that other countries might be taking. Are there pathways for us to be able to mature education research that we're funding that allows us to be able to institutionalize and then scale that education research results and impacts in a number of institutions, multiple institutions across the board? Are there pathways where we can take research that we support and potentially harden and mature that so that it's ready for uptake by policymakers at the FCC or the EPA and so on? So what are the various mechanisms of other innovative pathways that allow us to have the translational impact of the research that we're trying to support? So I hope that gives you a sense for sort of those three key functions around partnerships, innovation and technology ecosystems that we hope to catalyze through those partnerships. And finally, thinking about how we then accelerate the translation of technology to practice. And I mean practice broadly writ, not just to startups and new markets, but beyond that as well. So for the last part here, then I'm going to focus in on specifically some key programs. And I'm going to highlight, I think if there's time, I'll try to get to a couple of key programs that I think may be of interest to folks today. The first is around regional innovation in that sort of second functional layer, if you will, for the foundation, though, as you can see, there's a lot of crosswalk across these three layers as well. So we announced the NSF Regional Innovation Engines or NSF Engines program just a couple of weeks ago. Did a webinar this past Tuesday. I know some of you were at that webinar, did a roadshow yesterday, and we're starting this series of regional roadshows over the course of the next several weeks. Our goal with the Regional Innovation Engines program is to be able to use innovations in use-inspired research as a driver to be able to cultivate new regional scale innovation ecosystems throughout the US. Specifically, we want to be able to marry both the scientific and technological challenges that we know we face with societal and economic challenges as well. And so that's what the chart on this slide tries to illustrate. You can think about societal challenges like climate change or equity or critical and resilient infrastructure or others that you can surely enumerate as well. You can think about technology areas like the ones on the bottom of this chart: AI, advanced manufacturing, advanced wireless, biotech, and so forth. And there are others as well. Materials, for instance, is not on here, but certainly an important area of exploration as well. And then you see the bidirectionality between these two. And that's really important to us because I think you all would agree that as we think about some of the challenges that we face in the climate change space, those challenges inspire new research directions in AI. And at the same time, as we think about new innovations in AI, that allows us to have new lenses on the climate change challenges that we face. And I used AI and climate change as an example there. You could imagine multiple bidirectional pairings across this landscape. At the same time, we also want to facilitate the synergies between technical innovation and geographic innovation. So again, to use an example of climate change, the way that that manifests on the West Coast is very different than it manifests in other parts of the country. So for example, a lot of discussion about wildfires and droughts in the West Coast and the Southwest, particularly over the last few weeks. A lot of discussion here in the mid-Atlantic, where I am, and across the eastern seaboard around destructive storms that roll through and the impacts of those. And so as we think about some of these societal economic challenges, as we think about some of these key technology areas, trying to be able to harness the unique geographic characteristics across the country that help shape and frame how we think about these problems is another piece of how we're thinking about the Regional Innovation Engines program. And so for us, this is an intentionally different approach. It's a different scale of investment for starters. We're talking about investments to the tune of about $160 million over a 10-year horizon for a given regional innovation engine. We're talking about that iterative co-design and co-creation where we engage a broad and diverse set of stakeholders, the users, in helping to shape and then also be a part of the research and piloting and prototyping that's taking place. It's going to require, I think, training for the teams that are engaging as part of these regional innovation engines about how you can achieve success over the long term. What are some of the key steps and best practices to be thinking about to cultivate a regional scale innovation ecosystem? Ongoing evaluation of the concept and the approach itself at a program level, but then also milestone requirements for continued funding for individual projects, understanding that not every regional innovation engine that we fund on day one may make it all the way through 10 years. And sometimes it's okay for us to have that prototypic failure mode, if you will, to be able to achieve the sets of successes that we would like. And then in terms of what success looks like, I think what's maybe most important from all of these bullets, and for the sake of time, I won't go through each one of these one by one, but what's most important here is an understanding that this starts from a place of fundamental use-inspired research. Having said that, when we think about the impacts that we want to have with that research, it is not strictly about conference papers and publications, depending on the field that you might be in. But it goes beyond that to think about the new technology capabilities that are being churned out, to think about the new education capabilities that are being unearthed. And again, education at all levels, not just researchers, but thinking about practitioners and entrepreneurs and technicians and others as well. And so thinking about a little bit of a culture change, if you will, around how we sort of bring into various organizations this emphasis on use-inspired research and innovation, this emphasis on technology translation and entrepreneurship as well, I think is really core to what we're hoping to see happen here. So when I think about the Engines program, I'm reminded of existing innovation ecosystems that exist in different parts of the country. And, surely I could have pointed to ones that maybe would have been more favorable for you folks, but I picked out four that I think are really exemplars. And they're also not strictly on, in big cities per se, or on the coasts per se. So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right? I think you all are familiar with the robotics industry that has set up shop out there around the universities, whole slew of startups and innovation activities taking place. Nashville, Tennessee, just across the border in terms of sort of investments that we're seeing happening on a regular basis around the medical device industry, around the hospital and the universities there. Chattanooga, Tennessee, with the Electric Power Board that a number of years ago deployed high-speed fiber optic cable to optimize the power distribution network. But that has now become the basis for a quote-unquote gigabit economy, different sense than the way it's usually used, but a gigabit economy that's kind of set up shape in and around the Chattanooga community. And then Huntsville, Alabama, with the military Air Force base there and the defense and aerospace industries that have congregated around Huntsville. So those are 4-point examples of innovation ecosystems, very different in terms of topic space, in terms of flavor, in terms of composition, and in terms of what's made them successful. But what we would hope to see, the hypothesis here with the NSF Engines program, is can we replicate that success in other parts of the country, particularly in parts of the country that don't today have thriving innovation ecosystems, and focusing in on key science and technology areas that allow us to be able to address societal and economic challenges. So another way of thinking about this is, can a significant investment by NSF together with sort of the framework of what we would like to see around partnerships with multiple sectors, around this emphasis of a topic area of regional relevance, trying to be able to address societal and economic challenges along the way, starting from a place of use-inspired research, can that emphasis sort of serve as a nucleus for an NSF engine that allows us to be able to cultivate a regional scale innovation ecosystem that grows over the duration of the funding and grows over the duration of the funding to the point that that innovation ecosystem becomes self-sustaining beyond the lifetime of the NSF investment across a decade. And so that's the experiment that we're trying to run, if you will, with these regional innovation engines and the RIE's program. We would certainly encourage you all to take part. The first webinar has passed, but we have Q&A sessions coming up. And we also have upcoming a series of regional roadshows that I would encourage all of you to take part in as well. One thing that I would stress, please don't think of the location of Kentucky, for example, within a regional roadshow as any indication of us suggesting that should be the region for a regional innovation engine. This is more about us trying to be able to divide up the country in a meaningfully sized way that allows us to be able to have conversations with folks at the right, in a sufficiently sized room, and also do breakout rooms on Zoom as well as we do these regional roadshows over the next few weeks. And then the deadlines for the program, just to stress, I'm sure many of you have seen this, we have deadlines for the concept outlines for the development grants, the sort of planning activities, type 1s, as well as for the full larger sized engines, concept outlines that are due at the end of June. And then we've announced deadlines for the type 1 proposals later this fall, and hope to announce deadlines for type 2 proposals a bit down the road as well. One final sort of piece around the regional innovation engines that I want to stress. Sometimes there's the question, well, where does this come from? Like, why is NSF? This is I would hope folks would agree, a pretty significant step for the foundation. What do stakeholders in Washington think about this? I think many of you have seen and heard the talk in the news of competing legislation, quote unquote, on the Hill between the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that's passed the Senate, as well as the America Competes Act of 2022 that's passed the House. The important point here is that a lot of how we're thinking about the regional innovation engines is grounded in and aligned with what we're seeing in those pending legislation pieces as well. So for example, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act calls for NSF to establish university technology centers that would conduct multidisciplinary research around key technology focus areas that would bring together partners from multiple sectors in a meaningful way, and that would support capacity building too for entrepreneurs and students and educators alike. So that's one piece of legislation. And another, the America Competes Act, specifically calls for NSF to stand up technology research institutes. So, we now have 3 names: regional innovation engines, university tech centers, technology research institutes. We can't get in our way more in terms of naming, but if you get past the naming, really focusing in on trying to conduct fundamental research to advance key technologies to solve societal, economic, and health and related challenges, and to do so in partnership with other agencies and organizations while growing research experiences for students in government and industry. So really trying to, when I look at these two slides and the content that I've highlighted on these two slides, and I look at the regional innovation engines, there's a significant amount of alignment, and that I think is by design. And so there may be some disagreements in other parts of these pending pieces of legislation, but at least as far as the regional innovation engines and this particular approach within NSF, there is a lot of alignment. So I'm going to very quickly just kind of highlight one other set of programs, and then I will wrap up here. And this set of programs is around technology translation. So I talked earlier about the lab to market platform. And indeed, in a typical year, NSF will fund anywhere between 8,000 and 11,000 new research projects. As you all know, those research projects progress, and some get to a point, and in some programs, we have the opportunity even for faculty and students to get a supplement called Transition to Practice that allows them to start to harden or mature their outputs, to start to think about potential translation pathways. And then we have some lineages. So if you want to go down the path of a new product or startup, you can go down the path of PFI, I-Corps, SBIR, STTR programs that I talked about earlier, the lab to market platform. You don't have to do all three. You can pick and choose, and you don't have to do it in the order of PFI to I-Corps, for example. But there is a lineage that we hope meets folks where the needs are in that pathway from lab to market. But there are other forms of translational impact, as I talked about earlier, open source ecosystems, for instance. The TIP Directorate has just launched a new program, Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or POES. As a matter of fact, the first round of proposals came in just a few weeks ago for this program, where we try to provide resourcing to faculty and students as they think about resourcing and curriculum, as well as they try to think about the progression from an open source product to an open source ecosystem that can have long-standing innovation potential into the future. And then, as I talked about earlier, there are these other potential pathways for translation as well that it's TBD here, but that we have aspirations out of TIP to potentially build out and try to meet folks where they are specifically in the context of each of these potential outputs of research in the longer term. So I hope that that gives you a sense of now sort of the functions, as well as some example programmatics, including a couple of our key programmatics within the TIP Directorate as we continue to move out into the future. And then the last point that I want to highlight is around diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility. And the title of this slide is very significant: Designing in DEIA. The reason that we say designing in, so this is kind of borrowed from the world of cybersecurity. Some of you may be very familiar with that. For many years, and I'm a computer scientist originally by training, so hopefully it's okay for me to say this. For many years, we used to design new software systems, design new tools, and then think about how to secure them, how to ensure their security and integrity into the future. And I think that there's been a realization over the last decade or two that we need to focus intentionally on starting out by designing in security from the very beginning. And so the same thing in some sense is true with respect to diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility. I talked about how a key mission for the directorate is thinking about that horizon of the geography of innovation that exists all across the country, and really providing opportunities to tap into STEM regardless of where you are. And so that requires us to think about what are the challenges and the barriers that keep people from doing that today, keep institutions from engaging with NSF today. And that led us to a number of focus group and listening sessions over the course of the winter and spring months that really served to inform how we designed the Regional Innovation Engines program. And that I think as we learn from those listening sessions in terms of the challenges that different institution types face around capacity building, around issues about NSF policy, the 2-month limitation on support for faculty, and how that is really a hardship when you have a heavy teaching load, for example. So thinking through some of these lessons learned and how we can potentially design programs in TIP and across NSF for that matter into the future to really take those into account. So with that, I'll pause by just noting that we're really pleased to be able to get the TIP Directorate off the ground. We have been able to reposition some of our existing programs. We're planning and have launched now some new investments, and we are recruiting. So if you or others are interested in potentially working in the TIP Directorate, eventually we have to staff a whole directorate. We have some great talent that has moved into TIP as part of existing programs, and we've brought on some new folks for the regional innovation engines, but we're going to continue to have staffing needs. And so if you have particularly interests in use-inspired research innovation, please do feel free to reach out as well. So I'll pause. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to the questions and the dialogue in the next hour as well.
Thank you. And thank everyone who has been sending me questions throughout this presentation. I've have a few here queued up that I would like to ask, and I'll start with this question. Can you speak about shifting the NSF research paradigm, one that is use-inspired, solutions-focused, and translational, otherwise known as a market or demand pull model? What was the inspiration for this model, and where else is it being used successfully?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Landon. Thanks very much for that to whomever posed that question. So I tried to cover that a little bit at the outset of the presentation in terms of the inspiration. I think that that's partly rooted in, the challenges that we face today, the societal economic drivers we see today, the global competitiveness challenges, the recognition that we have nearer term issues that we need to tackle in order to maintain the US in the vanguard of competitiveness. So I think there are some motivating factors at that level that I would reference in the context of this sort of paradigm shift that I described. Again, I also think that when we think about those motivating factors, that has resonated with our colleagues on Capitol Hill, for example, and some of the authorizing bills that I showed a couple of chunks of text from. It's also resonated with our new director at the foundation, Sethuraman Panchanathan, who joined NSF almost 2 years ago now, and came with this vision of how do we not take away from the great work that NSF has done all over the course of the last many decades, but how do we sort of continue to innovate even within the foundation and allow us to be able to support the curiosity-driven, discovery-oriented research and also support the use-inspired, solution-oriented research. So I think it comes from, in a nutshell, a number of different places and perspectives, but it's sort of all kind of conspiring together, if you will, to help us think about this sort of spotlight on use-inspired and translational work.
Thank you. Emma McClure asks, are there specific topic areas that TIP intends to focus on, such as the key technology focus areas that were expressly named in the Endless Frontiers Act and USICA's proposed Regional Tech Hub program, where there'll be a list of priority areas?
Yeah, so thanks, Landon, for that, and thanks for the question. So a couple of ways that I would answer that. So first of all, I think that when you think about the TIP mission space more generally, it is absolutely the case that we see ourselves focusing in on critical and emerging technologies like the ones that are enumerated in the Endless Frontier Act, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, now the Bipartisan Innovation Act. So we definitely see ourselves resonating with those, as well as the broader societal economic challenges that I think some of which I talked about and that exist. Having said that, for example, in the case of the Regional Innovation Engines, the Engines program, we are not in this round of the Engines program calling out a specific, we're not saying that we're especially interested in these 2 or 3 or 4 technology areas. We really want to provide sort of the framework, the investment, the concept, and we want to see, based off of that, what are the specific topic areas. Again, think about key technology areas in general, think about societal economic challenges in general, but within that context, what are some of the key areas for a particular region that makes sense to pursue, where maybe you have some loosely connected stakeholders and there's an opportunity for us to be able to more tightly integrate them as we look to the future through an Engines framework.
Thank you. Next question comes from Pete Ellingston from Procter & Gamble, and he asks, how should industry and academia think about how intellectual property will be handled via TIP-funded research? And then there was another similar question that was asked by another attendee. What is NSF plan to protect IP generated through these collaborations?
Sorry, can you say that second question one more time?
What is what is the NSF's plan to protect IP generated through these collaborations?
Okay, great, thanks.
Mhm.
So the best way I think for me to answer that is to say that, we have talked about, for instance, in the um, Regional Innovation Engines funding opportunity. And I encourage you to check out the webinar and check out the upcoming Q&A sessions with some of these very specific questions about the engines in particular. We've talked about how we do expect that the team that comes together will think through what is their IP plan and how are they going to collaborate working together around that plan. Having said that, I think the important point that I would make here, and maybe this is a little bit provocative, is I personally don't believe that at the end of the day, we always sort of tend to get hung up on IP. We tend to get stuck on, how do we think about the intellectual property? How are we going to protect the intellectual property and so forth? And I would challenge us both in academia and industry, and also from a government perspective, to go a little bit beyond that thinking, right? When we think about just how much has IP generated in terms of revenue for universities across the country, I would challenge the assumption just a little bit. And so, yes, we want to be sure that everyone understands in a given engine, in a given project, what does that look like? How are we setting that up? How is the team setting that up? And how are the partners going to interface? But I would hope that at the end of the day, there's a recognition that we're starting from a place of use-inspired research and we're trying to drive forward progress. And we shouldn't let IP become the sticking block.
Thank you. Let's see. Hassan Panwala from UK asks, when a proposal for a convergence accelerator track has components that overlap with topics from previous tracks, such as AI or secure 5G, should we keep such components as proposed work or plan to use outcomes of previous tracks?
So that's a great question. It is a very specific question, though, and I think that the answer to that question is going to vary depending upon the specifics of the proposal that you have in mind. So in general, let's take, for example, AI and the future of work, right? That's one of the tracks that we have supported out of the CA. And then another example might be the track that's focused on helping to address persons with disabilities, right? Maybe there's some overlap there where there's some work in the first track that could come to fruition and help support a project in the second track. I think if there are opportunities to be able to seize upon existing work that's already out there that's been supported. I mean, this is true for any research grant, right? You should definitely seize upon that. At the same time, though, I don't think you need to feel as though you have to constrain yourself to something that the CA has already done when it comes to a future track. But again, I think the specifics of that question are really important, and I might encourage our colleague who's asking that question to share that with the Convergence Accelerator directly. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll loop in the right folks within the Convergence Accelerator to try to be sure that we get you a more precise answer in your specific use case, if you will.
Yeah. Thank you for that response. Thank you, San, for the question. One more here. We have Nick Such from Awesome Inc. asking, or it seems that computing is a major emphasis of the NSF in the near term, even alongside each research areas. Kentucky, however, lags behind most of the country in its participation in computer and mathematical occupations, employers, and K through 12 training, with barely 50% of high school students with the access to a computer science course. What advice do you have for our state to begin growing in this key innovation area?
So a couple of things that I would say about that. One is, that's a great question, by the way. I think that computing is certainly an area of emphasis. I mean, it's one of the directorates at the National Science Foundation. It also, I think, is very intimately tied with national competitiveness more generally as well. Having said that, there are a number of efforts afoot within NSF. So my colleagues where I used to work in the computer science directorate here, for instance, have pioneered CS for All, working collaboratively with colleagues all across the country and local and state level stakeholders to be able to try to get computing into high school classrooms. And so I think you have to start from that level in terms of sort of the workforce training and building the, not just the competencies, but the excitement in computing from the start. And there's a brand new, relatively speaking, over the last 5 years, AP Computer Science Principles course that strives to teach computing in a way that is of interest and exciting to diverse audiences. So I think it starts from there. And then I think more generally, it's about, again, I'll come back to something I talked about earlier, partnerships. It's about trying to catalyze the partnerships that allow you to understand what are the challenges that you face in a particular state or region, and is there some shared expertise elsewhere that can be brought to bear almost in a sort of mentoring role? Are there shared resources elsewhere that can be brought to bear in almost a mentoring role? So yes, Kentucky, in terms of its numbers, in terms of its population that's pursuing computing and mathematics education and those core competencies. While there's CS for All, there's also, are there opportunities for partnership with other neighboring states where maybe there are more students pursuing those degrees and those competencies? And so is there an opportunity to build partnerships and learn from some of the best practices elsewhere and bring those to bear in a given state? So I think that, you know, I would sort of take a strategic, but nonetheless sort of all hands on deck approach as I think through something like that.
Great. I think we have time for one more. There's been a few questions come through pertaining to Intel, and there's one here from Steve Rankin that asks, the example cited in the NSF industry partnership was a $20 billion investment from Intel linked to the $50 million contribution from NSF. Is the goal of the regional innovation engines to build education and research efforts around existing successful industries, or to innovate and move industries that do not yet have the ability to invest in that kind of manufacturing facility?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Steve. And I think that's going to require a little bit of a longer answer. I think the short answer to your question in the time that we have is that, you know, we are really interested in trying to be able to innovate and catalyze new industries through the Regional Innovation Engines program. And we're interested in trying to be able to do that in regions of the country that, again, maybe have sort of the skeleton of being able to stitch that together, but could use a lot of investment and focus and framework to be able to really orchestrate that and deliver on that. Having said that, you know, the first part of your question, to build research and education research efforts around existing successful industries, I think I'd want to understand a little bit more what you mean by that, because I don't want to just give a flat out no answer to that. There's probably something in there that you may be thinking about that we should explore in a little bit more depth. I encourage you to feel free to reach out or maybe join one of the breakouts that follows this, and we can talk more about that.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this morning for this insightful and inspirational virtual event. Great turnout. The UK Innovation Connect team are delighted to continue hosting events such as this one in the future. I'd like to especially thank Dr. Cassis for her opening remarks, and of course, Dr. Ganchandani for spending his Friday morning with this innovation ecosystem represented here today. As I mentioned previously, this session has been recorded and will be made available on the UK Innovate YouTube channel. You will receive a link later on with to this recording via email. And again, thank you all for joining, and have a great weekend.